We often frame the Allied powers of World War II as a unified front marching against fascism, but the historical record shows a different reality. This alliance was a product of mutual desperation, fused together by the sudden necessity of survival. Look closely at the men staring across this table. You have a communist dictator, the prime minister of a fading global monarchy, and the president of an isolationist democracy. 2 years prior, some of them had been signing non-aggression pacts with the very enemies they were now meeting to destroy. And then there is the mystery nation. One of the primary Allied powers fought the Axis for 4 full years before America entered the war. They lost 14 million people. Yet in many Western history curricula, their name barely appears in the index. To identify who actually defeated the Axis, we have to look past the political speeches. We need to audit the raw military data, account for the lives lost by every member of the alliance, and reach a conclusion based on the actual distribution of combat and industry. When the United States entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, its immediate value was industrial. America became the ultimate supplier, pouring $50 billion in Lend-Lease aid, ships, food, and aircraft into every Allied theater. This created a unique economic situation. While the infrastructure of Europe and Asia was reduced to ash, the United States economy doubled in size. Unemployment dropped from 15% to near zero. America was the only major power to emerge from the war financially stronger than when it started. The Soviet Union paid for the war in a different currency. On the Eastern Front, whole cities were pulverized into concrete dust. The Soviets broke the German advance, but at the cost of 27 million dead citizens and soldiers. 1 out of every 7 people in the USSR died, yet these two ideological opposites were entirely codependent. Stalin privately admitted to his inner circle that the Soviet military could not have maintained its counteroffensives without the 400,000 logistics trucks manufactured by American auto workers. Between those two titans sits the United Kingdom. Britain holds a specific distinction. It was the only major power to fight from the first day in September 1939 to the very last. From June 1940 to June 1941, they stood completely isolated against Nazi Germany. They survived, and they kept the Atlantic supply lines open. But outlasting the Luftwaffe bankrupted the British Treasury. By the time victory was declared, the financial exhaustion of the war forced Britain to begin dismantling the global empire they had just spent 6 years defending. The narrative gets more complicated when we step outside the Big Three. France fell to Germany in just 6 weeks. While Free French forces fought heroically in exile, the puppet Vichy government in the south actively collaborated with the occupiers, deporting 77,000 Jews to death camps. Then we have the Republic of China. Long before the invasion of Poland, China had been fighting a full-scale war against a Japanese invasion since July 1937. For 8 years, they fought with minimal Western aid. By tying down over 600,000 Japanese troops on the Asian mainland, the Chinese army absorbed the primary weight of the Japanese ground war, which drastically reduced the number of divisions the U.S. would face in the Pacific. Other nations with smaller populations performed heavy lifting relative to their size. Canada mobilized 1 in 10 of its citizens to escort 25,000 merchant ships across the Atlantic, while 1 million Australians held the defensive line in brutal jungle combat across the Pacific. After Singapore fell in 1942, Australia realized the British Navy could no longer guarantee their safety. In a permanent pivot, they aligned their defense strategy with the United States, a shift in foreign policy that remains in place 8 decades later. India provided the largest volunteer military force in history. 2.5 million men stepped forward to fight across 4 continents, despite their own country being in the middle of a struggle for independence. Those soldiers fought to preserve a British Empire that was drawing heavily on Indian resources. While Indian troops secured victories abroad, wartime food distribution policies contributed to the Bengal famine of 1943, where up to 3 million people starved to death. For these nations, the Grand Alliance was a trade-off where their regional interests and human lives were often treated as secondary to the goals of the great powers. The smaller members of the alliance often provided the critical advantages that shortened the war. Poland lost 17% of its population, yet even before the first shot was fired, Polish mathematicians had cracked the German Enigma machine and shared the secret with British intelligence. Despite fighting from day one, Poland was handed over to the Soviet Union at the Yalta Conference. To avoid offending Stalin, the British government did not even invite the Polish forces who had fought for them to the victory parade in London. Even Brazil played a role, as the only Latin American nation to send ground troops to Europe. 25,000 Brazilian soldiers fought elite German mountain units in the freezing conditions of the Italian Alps, an environment completely alien to their training. The common theme for these nations was that their vital contributions were frequently overshadowed by the politics of the superpowers, or entirely erased from the official victory narrative. When we finalize the ledger of who contributed most to victory, we have to look beyond the big three. We must weigh China's 8 years of resistance, India's massive volunteer force, and Poland's intelligence breakthrough against the industrial and military weight of the superpowers. This chart shows the percentage of German military forces destroyed by the Allies. The United Kingdom ranks third, acting as the indispensable stronghold that sustained the war. The United States ranks second, serving as the arsenal of the entire alliance and the primary victor in the Pacific. But the Soviet Union sits at the top of this military ledger. The Red Army was responsible for destroying roughly 75 to 80% of all German military forces during the war. Logistically and mathematically, the Eastern Front was the furnace that consumed the German army's resources and manpower. While the atomic bomb and Western industrial power were decisive factors in ending the war quickly, the data shows that the Soviet Union bore the primary burden of dismantling the German military machine. The modern world was built on this complex mosaic of temporary conveniences and staggering hidden sacrifices. From the Polish codebreakers to the Chinese infantry, every nation played a role that the others could not have fulfilled alone. Challenge the common narrative in the comments. Which of these forgotten nations do you believe history has treated most unfairly?